All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, December 15th, and over the weekend we had a couple of horrific shootings. We had the Bondi Beach shooting in Australia, and then we also had at Brown University a couple students killed, school shootings. So, it, did this happen much when you were younger, my age? Like, this seems to happen all the time here in the West.
When I was, well, your age, yeah, I think they really began. I'm sure if you go way back, you can find other incidents, but they were extremely rare until the 1980s. And I think it was that shooting in Colorado. There was the two gamers, that went through a high school and just shot up, killed a lot of people. That seemed to be where um, began the wave of these shootings. So, in my memory, I think that that's true. And then since then, it's become an all too regular occurrence.
Well, is that specifically school shootings that have become an all too regular occurrence, or just these public mass shootings in general?
Yeah. I guess um, I can think if there was a mass shooting in the 60s, but again, it's just like one, and I think they become more common. The majority of them do seem to take place at schools, whether high schools, university campuses, occasionally even elementary schools, but not necessarily at schools. Yeah, it does seem to be. I think there's no question about it. It's a more frequent occurrence now than it used to be a couple generations ago, certainly.
Why do you think that is? Is that just a society breakdown? Is that just a sign of a sick society that this is happening more, or
Yeah,
is it like drugs, which is also part of a sick society, I guess? But
yeah, I guess so. I guess in some cases, yeah, you find out that these people were on, were being medicated, maybe failed to take their medications. It's not clear sometimes if the medications contribute to what they're doing or if it's the failure to take it, which causes it. I think it probably is a symptom of, this is a completely uneducated opinion, but a symptom of social breakdown, increasing isolation. You just have more and more unbalanced individuals living in kind of a fantasy world. And these fantasy worlds are very easy to create these days because of, all the technology that we have, social media and the internet that just makes you can exit the real world and enter a fantasy world. And then maybe in this fantasy world, you're some sort of violent demigod. And then you go out and you act on your fantasy. Again, I'm just throwing something out there, but I don't really know, now when we don't even know what the motivations are. Well, I think we have some sense of what happened in Australia. I think very little is known about the shooter, who, by the way, has the last name of Erickson. I think it's Benjamin Erickson was apparently the shooter in
at Brown
Brown,
University.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. But in Australia, we're talking about this is a different phenomenon. They were Salafists. That seems to be as much as we know about them, to say Sunni extremists. And so likely that's, we don't know for sure, but likely that's what motivated the shooting, because they attacked a Hanukkah gathering on a beach in Australia, Bondi Beach.
Do you find the Bondi Beach shooting at all suspicious?
Well, I've read a little bit that suggests that we should at least treat it with a certain amount of skepticism. I think it's probably what it appears to be. To Salafists or, who have subscribed to this ideology, in which, Jews are among those people that are the enemy and that you rightfully can use violence against. But there are some questions. I read somewhere or saw some little report that there was a Google search for this particular name, the name of the main shooter, just a couple of weeks ago, and that's very strange. It's just never had happened before. So it makes you wonder.
A couple of spikes, right?
Yeah,
out of Tel Aviv, Googling out of Tel Aviv.
Okay.
That's
yeah,
where they're being Googled.
Okay, there might be a reason for that. Maybe they did have reason to suspect this guy, but it doesn't mean that, that they were actually behind it or supporting him or something like that. We just don't know. But going back nearly a year ago, I think at the beginning of this year, I believe it was at the beginning of this year in Australia, there were some, let's say, some phony anti-Semitic incidents. There was a case of a Jewish young man calling a Jewish cultural center and threatening. It was first reported in the press as some kind of anti-Semitic incident, and then they found that it was actually a manufactured anti-Semitic incident by this Jewish young man. And there were some other cases, similar cases, incidents that took place earlier. So I think we certainly should be investigated. I doubt. Well, I guess those searches suggest that maybe it's possible, it's reasonable to suspect that the Israelis knew something about it. It doesn't mean that they were actually behind it, but maybe they saw that there were these guys who clearly wanted to commit an act of violence against Jews. And they understand, I think there's no question about it, that among Zionist Jews, they understand that anti-Semitism is wonderful. Anti-Semitic incidents, in the outside of Israel, they're all in favor of that. It's fuel for Zionism. I think that's the phrase that Max Blumenthal used. I think that's really quite correct. And so it's not impossible that they knew about this and, like, for example, managed to get them the guns, because it's very hard to acquire guns in Australia. The gun control laws are extremely strict. So I think at least that should be investigated. I'm not going to jump to any conclusions, but I think that should be investigated.
Right. Yeah. I find the gun thing suspicious because gun laws are very strict in Australia. It's not easy to get a gun. And I saw the police officer or whatever giving a briefing, and they said that the father had licenses for 6 guns, but he's here on a tourist visa. So how does somebody on a tourist visa get a license for 6 guns in Australia? It just doesn't. Maybe there's something else I'm missing, and that would make sense. But it just doesn't seem like you could just show up as on a tourist visa, or just not. I don't even know if he was a citizen. I know Naveed was a construction worker. I don't know if he was a citizen. He was a Pakistani citizen, I think. Right. So it's like they weren't Australian citizens. So just the idea that they have licenses for guns doesn't make sense, right?
Right. I just don't know about their citizenship status. I mean, I can't really comment on that. I've heard it's a father and son, from Pakistan. And then there's direct evidence on social media that they were Salafists. They actually studied at a Salafist institute.
Maybe the younger guy, Naveed Akram, had Australian citizenship, but I saw somewhere that the father was on a tourist visa, and they said that he had the licenses for it. Maybe we'll find out more, but it just something doesn't smell right to me. It just feels, and this is just part of the world that we live in. Whenever I see these incidents, I immediately jump to this is a false flag, right?
Right. I think it's possible. I doubt that it's entirely a false flag. Like they were told to do this, that they were actually, that they're actual Zionist agents. I think that they're probably real Salafists, but it may have been that what I would say a possibility, and I'm not saying that this is true, a possibility is that they were identified, by, let's say, Mossad. There was an awareness, hey, these people, they want to kill Jews. Say that, we have these recordings. We know what they're saying within their group. They're disposed to carrying out a violent action. Let's help them do it, without letting them know who we are. And that could have happened. I don't think we can dismiss, but it's also possible that it was entirely just them, and that I don't know how they got the guns or whatever, but it was just them, and there was no help. I think we have to at least be open to it. We just don't know. Mm-hmm. And so, in any case, I want to emphasize that this is, which should go without saying, that I utterly condemn this. This is, and I think everybody should. There's just no excuse for this kind of thing at all. It's a horrific act. Innocent children, innocent people, were killed. And I don't know how many, somewhere from 10 to 15. I've heard different numbers. And everybody should condemn it. That's proper. I would just say that this is kind of what happens every day in Palestine, and like during the war, worse, entire families getting wiped out deliberately. It's not like, oh, this was an accident, this was just collateral damage or whatever. But we've seen that happen again and again in Palestine. It's like another day in Gaza, and it's that every day in Gaza just goes by, with a very rare exception. In general, it's just not commented upon. It's just, it doesn't seem to concern, all the right-thinking people in the West. Now, this everybody's terrifically concerned about. That's proper. Go ahead. Yeah, this is terrible. This should be condemned. I agree. I condemn it. But yeah, you also need to, if you actually think that Palestinian lives are of equal value, you should be condemning, those attacks that happen every day. Just day in and day out, the kind of atrocities that are committed within Palestine. And then the sickening thing, of course, is that immediately Netanyahu and his people and all the, other extreme Zionists just seized upon this. This is what makes you think that maybe this is something that they're behind, because they immediately, this is, Iran was behind it. This shows, why we have to fight the fight that we're, it becomes immediately is presented as a justification for genocide. And there's immediately an effort to tie these people, the perpetrators of this horrendous act, to various kinds of anti-genocide protesters, all around the world. They say they're all the same. You see, now you understand what we're fighting against. That's so. Again, like what Max Blumenthal said, this is anti-Semitism is fuel for Zionism. So they love it when it happens,
Right. And I mean, Israel's always issuing warnings saying, oh, beware, there'll be a Hamas terrorist attack in Europe, or there's something planned big, And so always these vague, watch out, these terrorists. And it's like, well, if you have something, show us, present it to us, instead of these vague terms,
Right.
And then also just the, I don't know much about Salafists or Salafism and Wahhabism, but are Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are these Salafist?
Yeah, it's fair to call them. It's not that every Salafist is a terrorist, or every Salafist is, a member of Al-Qaeda, not by a long shot. I think there are probably a lot of very decent Salafists. What it really means is sort of a very fundamentalist form of Sunni Islam. And when we talk about Takfiris, these are people that emphasize, condemn people outside of their definition of Islam. These are all infidels. So let's say different kinds, like Sufi Sunnis would be regarded as infidels, and all Shia are infidels. Of course, Christians and Alawites and Jews are all infidels. And so a Takfiri is actually, I think it's probably takes you closer to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS and so forth. But to say somebody is a Salafist doesn't mean that person actually supports terrorism. I think that's pushing it.
But these two shooters, they were Salafists, but were they Takfiris as well? Or we just don't know?
Yeah, well, they probably are.
Like
the fact that they are shooting Jews, that indicates that they're Takfiris, they kind of see their mission is to go after the infidel.
Yeah. But this is where I am always, I know you have a different view on this, but I just feel like the Takfiris, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, we know Al-Nusra, like there was the Jake Sullivan email, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Right. We know Israel has been using Al-Nusra fighters in Syria as well. They've been treating them and taking care of them, arming them. So it just, I don't know if the Mossad, CIA are behind a lot of this, but we also know like the whole story about how the Al-Qaeda terrorists brought down the towers in New York. That we gave them their visas. The CIA was involved with these Takfiris. So it just, and even going up to, for example, remember the Crocus City Hall attack. And before it, Victoria Nuland was like, oh, we got some nasty surprises for Putin. And then this happened. And immediately the U.S. was like, it was ISIS-K. And Russia's like, if you have information, share it with us. How did you know? Why did you so quickly jump to this ISIS-K? And then what is ISIS-K? It sounds like the CIA's
Yeah,
ISIS, you
right.
know,
I know
is what
people
it,
have argued that the ISIS-K is basically a CIA cutout,
or
and
yeah, CIA
you know,
slash Mossad, ISIS, you
yeah,
know?
yeah. Well, that's and I don't know that that's true, but that's a statement that is backed up with a certain amount of evidence. You know, if you go back in the history of, towards the end of. Well, during the U.S. occupation, that's when ISIS-K kind of came to be, and there seemed to be some CIA connections. So often, well, we know for a fact, that the CIA and, Israeli intelligence have both worked with these kind of people, these groups, and in many different places in the world, not just in Syria and in Afghanistan, but for example, in Chechnya, that's one thing that is that greatly disturbed Putin when he learned about that. That was something that he brought up with U.S. presidents, and they claimed not to know about it, but they had direct evidence that actually the CIA was working with the Chechen terrorists. So this is something, and many of whom were actually Al-Qaeda. I think were actually shipped in from other places with the help of the CIA. That's at least according to some, I think, very credible reports. So, yeah, this is something that you just can't dismiss out of hand. We work with Al-Qaeda. No, that can't happen. We do. Meaning we, we're talking about our government and the Israeli government. They do work with Al-Qaeda. But it doesn't mean that every such incident, they're behind everyone. We just don't know the extent. We don't know if these people would belong to any kind of organization at all. It just remains to be seen. So yeah, I am open to that possibility, but I'm going to just.
I'm pretty suspicious. I mean, just think about Al-Jawlani himself, right? Former ISIS, Al-Qaeda. He's a Salafist, Takfiri, right? And now we put him in, he was in a CIA prison for like 10 years, and now he's the president of Syria, and Trump is saying how handsome he is and such a great guy. It's just, and you think about when ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're rampaging through the Middle East, committing all these atrocities, slaughtering Christians, Alawites, Shias. And they never they don't care about Israel. They just sort of left Israel alone. But everywhere around, throughout Lebanon and Syria, just right around Israel, they're okay, but they never. So it doesn't add up, right? I mean, and it just makes sense. Like, if you're Israel and your strategy is that we got to keep the rest of the Middle East in the Stone Ages, we just have to breed chaos to keep them down. What's the best way to do it? Okay, let's really support this radical, Islamic fundamentalist group, these Takfiris, and then that way they can sow chaos. And it not only does it just keep these countries down and keep them in chaos, but it lets us easily paint in a broad brush to the rest of the world that, look, all Muslims are just crazy. These are the terrorists. They're bad, but these terrorists may not even exist without the funding and the support of the CIA and Mossad. And it goes to everywhere. I think even in Xinjiang in China, I think that the CIA, we're working that angle as well. There's a lot of them are from Central America, not Central America, Central Asia, that are being radicalized, and then they are being imported into Syria and other parts of the Middle East to sow chaos. And it's just, I don't know. I'm right now, that's my default operating position. That's how when I hear Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra, I'm thinking that this is just a CIA, Mossad, offshoot. Maybe they don't have full control, but they're we know that they're working with them. We know that because Al-Jawlani.
Well, they have in the past, and I think it's a very safe assumption to make that they are working with them now. And to some extent, we don't know what extent, where exactly, we just don't know. But that's not some crazy conspiracy theory. We just know. And Jake Sullivan himself talked about it.
We can see the emails. Al-Qaeda's on our side, so it's just like I don't know. I find it suspicious. And then there's this guy, I don't know if you saw on X, his name is Arsen Ostrovsky. He's just he's an Israeli. He's on social media all the time, always pumping Hasbara, and always these he's taking selfies all the time, like, oh, save us from Yemen attack, all these things. They survived the October 7th attack. He was here at this event too, and he took a selfie of himself covered in blood. I don't know if you saw it.
I saw it.
He said he's like, yeah, a bullet, grazed my head, and let me just get this perfect selfie. It just maybe it really did happen, but it just doesn't seem realistic that you would be there on October 7th and survive this. And then, or I don't know if he said he was there specifically, but I mean, he tweeted like, I survived October 7th and now, I'm surviving this. It's not safe for Jews anywhere in the world. This type of stuff that he's saying. It's just like, I don't want to just say that he's lying, but it just, I'm very, very, very suspicious.
Okay.
That this is staged, like if who would take that time to make that selfie? I mean, show us the wound too. If it was, I don't know. I don't want to go knock on this guy too much because I don't know, but it just, it doesn't add up to me. And I'm very suspicious of this whole thing. And
well, it's proper to treat this with a certain amount of skepticism. I think there's no question that's the proper way to approach these things. And so you have a right to be suspicious. I think many people do.
Aren't you more suspicious from our talk?
Yeah, just a little. Just a little bit. Yeah, but I think you always have to understand there are other actors out there. Because we focus so much on this, let's say Zionism, we understand their influence. That Zionist influence is global. We know that they work with these kind of groups. It's certainly possible that there is, let's say, a Zionist hand in all of this. It's certainly possible. There is the motive. That's number one. We understand why they might want this to happen. But it's not that everything that happens is actually they're behind everything. There are independent actors. It's a big world, and there are other people have agency and don't necessarily do things because Zionists tell them to do. Tell them to do it. They do it because they have their own hatreds, their own motivations.
Yeah, but this is they find these people and then that's what
maybe.
I don't know.
I know you may be right. I know I'm not saying that's a nutty conspiracy theory by any means. I think it's possible.
And I think we've talked about this before, just how Israel and just Zionism, how they're in a real pickle. They're just losing so much support. They have to try to do something to kind of divert attention, to shore up, to make us focus on the real problem is anti-Semitism. It's not what's happening in Gaza. We are the real victims.
There is a motive, and the motive is all the more powerful now. That's right. It's very true.
I mean, and all right, we'll follow this, go down these conspiracy things a little bit longer. Have you been following the Erica Kirk story at all?
I only saw some headlines, but I think she was interviewed by Barry Weiss or something, or at least on her network. And she condemned any sort of suggestion that Charlie Kirk was straying from the Israeli camp. Am I right in saying that? I just read some headlines.
Yeah, well, basically, she's gone on this media tour, and it's been, I think, a complete flop for her because she's just come off as very disingenuous, and she's there, talking about anti-Semitism and throwing out Hebrew words, saying, Charlie Kirk would come home on Fridays and throw off his jacket and say Shabbat Shalom. It's like, what is this? It's strange, And then she's just saying that's how she thinks that, the official story is legitimate. I believe it. She's telling Candace Owens just to stop asking questions. It just doesn't seem right. I mean, if you are, first of all, you just lost your husband in a very violent way in a very public setting. It's a bit odd to be sharing so many things, going on these tours. She doesn't seem to be acting like a grieving widow, and that's something that people talk about a lot. Is she's just going on, and it just doesn't feel genuine. Her expressions, her statements, and just if you think about what happened, like the official narrative just doesn't make sense. Everything from Tyler Robinson and the 30-06 would just blow his head off. How did he disassemble the rifle, get down the roof? The security footage, the text chain between Tyler Robinson and Lance Twiggs that just didn't make any sense, and no timestamps. These Egyptian planes that showed up. The fact that there were people on X before he was killed that saying someone very close to Charlie Kirk has told me that Charlie's afraid of his life. The fact that we had all these videos of showing that Charlie was straying away, and that damning text message that said that, you leave me no choice but to leave the Zionist cause, the Israeli cause. And then he's dead 40 hours later. And then his wife is coming here just saying how Shabbat Shalom and how great Israel is. And the whole thing just doesn't make sense. The fact that there were like 12 Israeli cell phones that were tagged at the shooting. She says, don't ask any questions. If this was your husband, he died, don't you want to know? Don't you have, or at least maybe you don't want to know, but you wouldn't be out there just doing this tour and doing a sort of, it just, something feels deeply, deeply wrong. And it resonates with so many people. Like my wife, she isn't political at all. She doesn't care. But she's on the Erica Kirk thing. She's like, something's wrong here. There's something wrong. This woman is clearly lying. This woman, it's just, that's what's coming off, and that's what everybody's seeing. So it's just, I'm wondering, like, why would you go out and do this type of media tour, media blitz? Well, it's probably because you're getting a lot of pressure from the Zionists who are that have taken over TPUSA, saying, like, we need to shore up support. That's what TPUSA, we got to do this. We got to, so I think that's what it is that she's being pressured and pushed, and she's might be in on it. Like her dad was the head of Israel Raytheon, like her father, her mother was Homeland Security. Like the whole thing just stinks. Everything is just, she has this weird story about in Romania of trafficking children at an orphanage, that just it's just. Anyways, there's something weird here.
Right. Well, I haven't followed it, and so I haven't actually listened to or watched any of the interviews. But I'll say just first of all, it's not wrong to ask questions. It's absolutely right to ask questions, and there's a very good reason to ask questions about this. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend that I know what happened. But yeah, there's ask the questions and keep on asking them until you get, some real answers. And if you don't get them, just keep on asking. I think that's completely proper. Right. It just seems that clearly they got to her. I think various people set her down and said, oh, you need to do this for TPUSA and for Charlie, this is what he would have won. And somehow they convinced her of it. And so she's gone out and it's an act, but she thinks she has to perform this act. The thing is that, again, I guess it's not fooling a lot of people. If it doesn't fool my daughter-in-law, I think that's very, very revealing.
It's worse now. I think a lot of people think that she's complicit in some way. I don't want to say that or insinuate, but that's how bad
that seems unlikely. But
right, but that's how bad the performance is. That's the social commentary is what I'm saying. It's just, I'm not going to say that myself, but
right.
So it's just the whole thing is just falling apart, and it just. If this comes out, though, because they're saying, like you said, just keep on asking questions, but they're trying to make us feel bad for asking questions. But it's not going to stop. And I just wonder if we get to the bottom of this, and if what a lot of people are already suspicious of, that somehow Israel was behind this, that will be catastrophic, right? It already is catastrophic that so many people are thinking it and are suspicious, such as myself. But if it comes out that the evidence is so damning that it is, that in itself will just finish off Zionism, right? It's like, my God. Especially Christian Zionists, right? Which is the bedrock of support.
Right. Well, I don't know that it's the bedrock of support, but it is an important foundation of Zionism in the U.S., no question about it. It just seems like it's rare that ever happens. That maybe sometimes it should happen, that some evidence comes out there, but the powers that be are very good at spinning things and, squirting a lot of metaphorical ink, to cover it up and to get distracted or whatever. So I don't think there's going to be a simple aha, a moment of truth. But we've already, like you say, it's already really hurt them. A lot of people are asking questions, and these are the kind of people that never would have. They just have a sense that something's wrong. And, whether or not they're right to suspect Israel, that's already, should be very alarming for a Zionist. I don't know if Israel is behind it, but again, many people do suspect that they're behind it. Some of them believe that very strongly, and with reason. It's not just some pathological anti-Semitism. It just says we've observed so much obvious attempts to manipulate information on behalf of Zionism that people have just become extremely suspicious whenever something like this happens. And again, with cause.
Right. I think it just, stuff like this, it just seems so sinister, so evil, so cloak and daggers that it just feels like that's to be relegated to fantasy novels. But because of what we've seen Israel do in the past couple of years, that's what makes everybody think like, well,
yeah,
okay,
I think
guess
that's
they're ready
true.
for everything.
Actually, for people that have been following the events in Palestine over the last several decades, I think we're aware of a lot of the really, for example, sadistic measures. I think our last episode we were talking about the very cruel restrictions on imports into Gaza that preceded October 7th. We were aware of those kind of things, and then obvious targeting of UN agencies and that kind of thing. But I think the average person, when they hear something like that, they had trouble believing it because it just seems so monstrous, and they just said, that just can't be true. So they would hear it, and then say, oh, it's just, shake their heads and just go on. But you're right. I think it's just those 2 years of the genocide in Gaza, and there's just one atrocity after another that it just became undeniable. They couldn't just look away and find that there's something really wrong. And so now when they hear something like this, a lot of them believe it or say, hey, yeah, that might actually be true. These people, I know what they're capable of. And before they didn't think they were capable of it.
Right, exactly. It's like, who could be capable of this? Well, there's one country that we all think could be capable of this now.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe let's. Is there anything else you want to talk about in the Middle East, or do you want to move over to the going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, we can move on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, with Ukraine, we were talking about just how these oil tankers that Ukraine was being rather cavalier with its attacks on these tankers in the Black Sea. They were posting the videos themselves and celebrating it. And you said this is going to come and backfire on them. This is one of the reasons why Russia may feel like it has to take Odessa, or Russia might enact an embargo on Ukraine as well. No shipping out of the Black Sea for Ukraine. And it seems like that might be where we're going. I know Odessa's been hit pretty hard recently. Can you tell me what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Russians struck a Turkish flag ship that was unloading. The Russians said military equipment. We don't have any confirmation of that. There was some report that that at least among the equipment that was being offloaded there was electrical equipment to repair the various substations and other, electrical infrastructure facilities that have been damaged in the Russian attacks. So this was struck by a Kinjal missile, and I think also by drones. And so it was a major attack, and it's not that they've never attacked ships in the port, but they haven't done it very frequently, really quite infrequently, and I don't think there's been an attack for a long time. So this is, I think, quite obviously retaliation. And at the same time, there was a very major attack on the city of Odessa that has just shut it down. I mean, the power is gone there. And to my knowledge, the power is still off. Maybe it's coming back online gradually now. But again, if Odessa doesn't have any power, the port's not going to have any power. This is, obviously a real blow to this very important transportation hub in Ukraine. And then there was I believe there was another Turkish flagged ship that was struck by an aerial drone. Now, the Russians haven't acknowledged that, but the Ukrainians have said that it was a Russian drone. So I don't know. We'll just set that to one side. But I think we are seeing very obvious retaliation. Again, Putin threatened it, and this time he carried it out very quickly. I think they just said we're just not going to tolerate this. We're not going to let this let them continually pick off or, attack our civilian tankers that are trading with us. If they're going to play this game, we're going to play it, and they're going to suffer the heavier consequences.
Are they suffering the heavier consequences? I mean, you said there's this one ship, the port of
Yeah.
Odessa. I mean, that's
Right.
the big one, just shutting down that port, right?
Yeah.
The electric.
Right. Well, I think they just showed what they can do, and right now it's a shot across the bow. We'll see if the Ukrainians continue with their attacks. Then I think we'll see the Russians ramp up the retaliations, and we may, if the Ukrainians insist on doing this, then we may see just a total blockade, whether in the form of mines or something else.
Do you think that we can see just more escalation on the high seas just in general? Because the U.S., we just took an oil tanker here, and then in the Black Sea, we're having these incidents tit for tat. Are we seeing kind of just sort of a breakdown of maritime law? I mean, international waters, you can just grab somebody's boat. I mean, won't that lead to some other action?
Right. Well, it's a very dangerous situation. Now, it goes way back. It really precedes the war in Ukraine. The Iranians have been subject to these seizures, and what the Iranians have done, because they know they can't go to a court or appeal to an international opinion, the West won't do anything about it. It's just when the Americans seize, or an American proxy seizes a tanker, there's just little comment. If that tanker is associated with Iran. So Iran just goes ahead and seizes a tanker from the other side. They retaliate. And I guess, again, the Russians looked in and say, yeah, we got to do something similar. You just have to immediately retaliate because, otherwise they'll continue. In this case, we're not talking about seizures. We're talking about attacks, but it's similar. It is worrying. It's, there was that story that came out recently that the Americans actually boarded a ship from China to Iran and actually seized some of the equipment on the ship, said that it was dual use, that it could be used by the Iranians to strengthen their military. And we haven't heard confirmation from the Chinese. It seems like it's unlikely the Chinese, are going to let things like that just happen, without retaliating in their own way. So there's another.
Well, when did that happen?
Apparently, it happened in November. I can't remember. It was mainstream media in which it was reported just the other day that this is something that happened. And again, I haven't heard any response from the Chinese side. I have trouble believing that the Chinese would not respond to something like this. I'm actually even surprised that it happened. We'll see. It was. Again, we're not talking about just some obscure Telegram channel, but I forget what it was, if it was the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or Reuters or something like that, but it was mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, if the Americans take this action and just start, like you said, even a Chinese ship, and then we just take this Venezuelan oil tanker as well, it may set precedents for the Europeans to take a Russian ship, because they've talked about that many times up in the Baltics. They're saying like, oh, the shadow fleet, we got to stop this. So maybe then it's like, well, okay, the Americans are allowed to just take tankers. Right. So I guess when we're part of America's group, we're their buddy. Let's do this, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is, like, when these taboos are broken and these red lines are crossed, then that's the danger. It's just like the fear of doing it goes away, and then we're in very dangerous territory. Well, of course, the Europeans already have seized a ship. They seized that tanker off the coast of France. So the French did, and they claimed they didn't actually make the statement officially, but everybody kind of suspected that they were looking for those mysterious drones. It's just, remember that was right on the heels of the drone scare. All those crazy drone stories and drones around airports and so on and so forth. And there was some theory that maybe these had been launched from a tanker, and so a tanker was seized, and it was held for a couple of days by the French, and then they let it go.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens on the high seas. What's happening on the land, though, here in Ukraine? We have many developments? How are things looking for
Yeah, well,
Zelensky?
yeah, I guess some Guliapole, again, that's that city in the south, a kind of a hub, not particularly large, but an important hub city and one of the last cities before, between the Russian armed forces and Zaporozhia, is falling, and it seems to be falling pretty quickly. There's a river that runs north-south through the town, cuts it in half. So the Russians have taken everything on the eastern half, and they're over on the western half. And so anyway, it looks like it's going to fall pretty quickly. It may be another week or two, but it's not going to be particularly long. And so that's a very important development. Again, it's just this whole area has been moving rapidly. You can even go back, if you go back to a little over a year ago, that Ugledar, it's this little fortress town in southern Donetsk, was taken. And after that, there's been just a steady advance, rapid by the standards of this war, to the west. And you actually find that, I think Guliapole is quite a bit farther from Ugledar than it is from Zaporozhia. So anyway, in a year, the Russians have advanced more than half the distance from Ugledar to Zaporozhia. That kind of gives you a sense of what's going, and it's probably only going to accelerate after Guliapole falls. So if this continues, on the current trend, we're going to see the Russians actually laying siege to Zaporozhia in well before 12 months from now, sometime in next year. It could even be early next year, because it just seems to be going. The advances are increasingly rapid, and there's really nothing left after Guliapole. I guess there's I forget exactly how you pronounce it, but there is one other town. But when that Guliapole falls, that will probably fall pretty quickly. The Russians are advancing from both the south and the east. So this whole section is on the verge of, it seems to be in the process of collapsing. Interestingly, it should be important. Again, we're talking about Zaporozhia, one of the major cities, one of the most important cities in Ukraine, and it's going to be under siege in just some months from now. I think it's safe to say, but the Ukrainians just don't seem to have the forces to hold back the Russians here. Now, the place where they're sending their forces, the forces that they do have, they're not really even spare forces, because you can see they're taking them from places where they're needed. But where they're putting them is actually on Kupiansk. And there they've had some success in counterattacking. And they made a huge deal about it. Zelensky went, well, there's a big controversy about whether he actually was there. I was
going to bring that photo up.
Yeah, right. I think there's a lot of reasons to be suspicious that he actually even went there. But, they show some on the outskirts, proclaiming this great victory. And they've been just milking these counterattacks for all they're worth, and actually having award ceremonies and everything, talking about winning the great battle of Kupiansk. And for the people who really pay attention to what's going on, they had some counterattacks. They have pushed back into some neighborhoods in the western part of the city. And they don't really have control over them, but they've created sort of a gray zone, a no man's land on, again, some neighborhoods on the western part of Kupiansk. But other than that, there's nothing. The Russians hold the rest of Kupiansk, and they are in fact expanding from Kupiansk to the south and to the east of it. So it's very similar to what actually happened in Pokrovsk. If you remember, the Russians broke through. It was back in August. They made a sudden breakthrough. They expanded very rapidly to the north, and then the Ukrainians actually threw a lot of forces at that. They really panicked them, and they managed to successfully counterattack to some extent and take back some of this land that was taken. Now the Russians are moving in and taking it back from the Ukrainians, and it looks like in just a very short while they'll have taken everything back up there, and they're also expanding from that salient too. And then while this was going on, the Russians just took Pokrovsk and basically, and Mirnograd is going to be theirs in just a couple of days now. So it was nothing, there was, the Ukrainians tried to claim that they had actually encircled Russians there, and even like the deep state mapping project showed encircled Russians. A lot of people pointed out, well, these Russians have been encircled there for now 2 months, and they're still encircled there. But it never happened. It never happened. Now they're doing something up and, similar in Kupiansk, similar to what they also did in Toretsk after the Russians took Toretsk, which was an important city, farther to the east. East and north of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians counterattacked, managed to penetrate into some neighborhoods. Some, even got maybe a few teams into the center of the city. They said that we've taken back Toretsk. And then after a couple of weeks, the Russians pushed them all out and they just continued to expand. Now Toretsk is way in the rear. And that's the same thing that's going to happen at Kupiansk. It's really public relations. And in the end, it's just very foolish, if you have, because these kind of counterattacks are extremely costly for the Ukrainians. If you're on the losing side, you really should be emphasizing defense. Defense is where you can conserve your resources and you can actually, make the advancing side pay a higher cost. But when you insist on going on offense, in these limited areas like counterattacks, your own casualty rates will shoot up. And what the Russians typically do is often they see them coming and they'll just kind of draw back and then just take the opportunity to create a firebag is what they call just rain death and destruction on them and then push them out and then continue to advance. And in the end, nothing is gained by the Ukrainians and they lose a lot of men and equipment. That's what we're seeing in Kupiansk.
But I feel like for Ukraine, being on the defensive isn't that helpful either. If you don't have any air superiority at all and don't have the firepower, they're just hunkered down. And then you might be able to survive a bit longer, but just basically you just get blasted until there's hardly anything left. And then they come in and mop you up, right? It's like what is the guiding principle for the Ukrainian military? And I'm sure they have these discussions there, if surrender is not an option, if negotiation is not an option, it's like, okay, then our only option is to try to win PR victories to hopefully create some type of black swan event or some type of get Trump in just the right mood when we have doing these victories to propel something forward from the West. That's the only thing. Like what can they do? If they just stay hunkered down, you just slowly die and you're not going to have any PR story other than the fact that we're holding them back a bit, but we just lose. And so like what is the guiding principle for the Ukrainian military? Is it guided by Instagram likes and reach? It almost I think it is, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's really as true as Zelensky and his people and so many of so many within the Ukrainian government. Zelensky himself came out of TV, right? And his Yermak, who has officially stepped down, but is probably still behind the scenes, doing what he's always done. He too comes out of the same thing. He was part of that that same media company, and so many of them are. That's something they understand and that they're good at, and they don't. And those are the only kind of battles that they really can win. Ever since 2022, those are the only kind of battles that they really have won. They're always temporary, but for people who aren't paying close attention, everyone says, "Oh, Ukraine did this incredible thing," and they hear another victory for Ukraine. They don't pay attention, and they don't even remember the name of the city that supposedly Ukraine retook. They don't notice that now it's deep in the rear. Even the Ukrainian mappers, like Deep State, admitted it. They eventually will. They'll show it deep in the rear. But people will just forget. They just remember these victories, and they don't really know what's happening. So it creates this illusion of Ukrainian success. And maybe that's, that makes you feel good. But it's the tactics that are using just guarantee that you're going to lose faster than you would otherwise. It's true, no matter what you do, you're going to lose, but you lose faster this way. and the collapse comes sooner.
But if you're going to lose no matter what, I mean, if that's clear, then why can we not get a deal? Why can they not get a deal? It's just that there's no movement on that front, right? I mean, the U.S. is pushing for it, I mean, but not pushing hard enough because, I mean, we have the leverage. We could just move out completely.
Right. No, I think it's clear already. Well, first of all, that so-called 28-point plan was not something that the Russians were going to accept. And all the reports that we're getting from all these various conferences are that they're now talking about a 20-point plan. And it's even farther from anything the Russians are going to accept. So the whole thing is silly. I don't think it's even worth talking about what they're talking about. It's just, it has nothing to do with reality. Well, why don't they accept it? It's something, I think Alexander Mercouris recently referred to it as a sunk cost fallacy. And that's one way of looking at it, is that you put so much into it. Let's say the Europeans have invested so much of their own equipment and billions, probably hundreds of billions of euros, and a lot of emotional, energy into this. It's just hard to walk away from it. You just think, well, now we can't just admit that we lost all that, that was just a one huge L, right? So we have to put in even more. That's the thing is. But of course, it's like, again, the sunk cost fallacy. I wasted a lot of money on this lemon, but I can't now walk away from it and admit that I just made a bad purchase. I'm going to spend another $5,000 to finally bring it around or whatever. What I would say is, that's one way to look at it. And it's often true of wars in particular. And especially because when you're talking about wars, you're talking about something so existential. You're talking about human lives. And it just becomes very, very, very difficult for the leaders of this country to say that, okay, we made a big mistake back there, and 1 million men, or who knows how many exactly, died unnecessarily, and we lost this much territory because of it. And if we'd taken that deal back then, we would be so much better off. It's an admission that I guess, again, it's just that so many people cannot make. But it's the reality, so what are you? You're between, that's the reality, but you just can't admit to the reality. So you just persist in believing in a fantasy, and you can't really explain how it's going to happen, but you just have to believe in it. There's going to be some wonder weapon. There's going to be some, a coup in Russia or whatever, and at some point, though, you just have to say, well, this is insanity. You just departed so far from reality. Okay, I can understand, and for the Ukrainians, because they're talking about their own lives, their own territory, it's harder for them to really sit down and look at this rationally. They should, for the sake of their own country, but you have to understand it's hard for them. Now, for the Americans, I think it's easier. It's farther away from us. And we really should be the ones who are saying, okay, look, we made a mistake. All of us made a mistake. Let's, cut our losses and just and have done with this, because it's only going to get worse. That would be the rational thing, right? And we see some impulses in that direction, but the problem is, again, we have very imperfect leadership, and Donald Trump, he's just not like, we don't need to go analyze his character again. But it's not just him, more than that. You just have so much of the leadership of both political parties and all the deep state, and even the Trump administration itself. A lot of them take the European point of view. Some of them as passionately as the Europeans. I think in general, not as passionately, again, because it's farther away from us. But they're also, have invested in this in a way that makes it really hard for them to walk away from it. Less so. I mean, it's like the one actor that could conceivably, seems really end this would be the U.S., because we've done it in the past. We've done it with other wars where we realized, okay, that didn't work out. And we walked away from Vietnam. We walked away from Afghanistan. We could walk away from this, but it doesn't look like we're ready to do it yet. Now, the Europeans seem to have have just gone, the European leadership anyway, has sort of like really gone over the edge. And it looks like they're not even capable of doing that. They're like the Ukrainians, they just can't admit to what the error that they've made.
Why do you think the Americans aren't ready to walk away yet? Because it sounds like there's an admission from the Americans that we can't win this, that it is lost. So if there is this admission, this realization, then what are we waiting for?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, there is an awareness among some people in the Pentagon and within the administration, but they are probably the minority. That the majority do believe, are like the Europeans, are just thinking that we need to persist. Something will happen. The Russians are really hurting, and eventually, what we have to do. This is the position that's always.
Really
I know it's
that?
crazy, but I think they actually do. You hear it again and again and again. This is, actually both like Larry Johnson and Daniel Davis, who have connections to the intelligence community in the U.S., and they do say that you'd be surprised, how many people, like even within the intelligence community, believe this. Yeah, and essentially they're being fed this by the Ukrainians, but they've chosen to believe it. There it's because, again, it's a corruption of these agencies. It's the ones who report what the people at the top want to hear. They rise and whatever. We've talked about that. So there are people that a lot of people that believe it. And they
believe what exactly? Believe
that we can't. There's still a chance of winning. I think their faith is growing shakier, but it's still there, and that the Russians are really hurting, and we'll bring them to the table if we just push a little harder. Than another sanctions package, another, I don't know, because the thing is they don't have very much. I know it's really great, but what can you say otherwise? How do you explain their behavior? I mean, really. Otherwise,
maybe it's just money, and that's they don't give a damn about how many people die, and they're all part of this military-industrial complex. And as long as they're getting paid, just keep on killing Ukrainians. They don't give a damn. I don't know. Maybe that's what it is. I just don't believe that they.
Yeah, well, maybe also short-term careerism. It's just like I don't want this to happen. Admit to the defeat. Maybe some of them know that it's going to end like Afghanistan or Vietnam or something. But I don't want it to happen on my watch, because it's going to look bad. Let's just like when I finish my term or whatever, we'll just let it happen then afterwards. There may be some people like that. I probably there
It's
are.
a long. If you're at the end of your career, you might be thinking that. But and this thing isn't going to drag on for another 20 years.
Yeah, I know. So, but what can you? It just seems like again they made this commitment, and they really went all in. And it's just it's that sunk cost fallacy, but it's just, it's much more than just their own interests. It's just a big part of, they've made this emotional investment. It's just like and they cannot, come to terms with the reality. It's just too painful. But then, so they are not capable of a rational discussion. A rational discussion, sit down and say, okay, what's going to happen? How are the Ukrainians going to win? And, you're on your 19th, you're working on your 20th sanctions package. What is it going to be? Package number 273, where it finally happens? Or, it's, that's the question that should be asked. But it just, there's virtually no sign of awareness. Now, this all ties into the whole question of the frozen assets. Why are they doing this? This seems like almost a suicidal act. Here we are getting some real pushback, and from the people that really know what this means, the central banks, the IMF, the Euroclear itself, its management, they're saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. This is really going to hurt us. It's going to hurt Europe. But they're hell-bent, the majority of European leaders are hell-bent on doing it, especially the
EU
top
bureaucrats.
leadership, right? We're talking
Ursula von der Leyen,
Kaja Kallas and Merz, the head of the largest, most powerful country in Europe. They're really hell bent on doing this, and why? It's just because I think when it comes down to it, is that they realize if they don't get them this money, it's curtains. It's just they don't. they're not able to actually do this democratically and go approach their own people and say, look, Ukraine is about to lose. We have to cough up some tens of billions of euros in Germany, another 10 billion and tens of billions in France or whatever. There are people who are going to say no. They know that. So, they're trying to really circumvent, the real democracy and just steal these assets, because I think they see that if they don't do it, it's all over. It really is. So there is a part of them that understands that they're in a real fix. The crazy thing is that, okay, you give them that money, they're still going to lose. It's just going to be a little bit slower. That's all,
Yeah, I just sometimes it's hard for me to understand why these leaders care so much. Why do they care so much about this Ukraine war? Is it maybe it's the emotional attachment, like you said, that they have actually just good relations with the Zelensky's regime. They're friends with Zelensky, so it's a personal thing almost. Like this is where they have this loyalty to Ukraine. I'm just wondering, like, why do they care so much? Or you say there's so many people within the intelligence agencies, all this. It's like, why do they care so much about Ukraine here?
Yeah.
When it's just, when you can't win this war, and there's some very questionable actors that we're supporting here,
right?
The neo-Nazis.
Yeah. Well, no, it's a difficult question. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. It's just clear that it has happened. They have, I guess it was building up, but when the war really broke out, and you really should go back to 2014. But for most, the watershed moment, the one I think where people really went all in, was with 2022 and the launch of the SMO. That, I think, for so many of these people, maybe maybe there's a certain kind of emptiness in Europe, and especially among the globalists, right? They're sitting pretty, they got a lot of money and whatever, but they have, maybe I'll just wax mystical, they are overseeing kind of a hollow civilization, and in one sense they sense it. And when this came to them, it was like a gift from the gods. This is a mission. Gives my life meaning. This is what, now we're fighting evil. We're good against evil, because that's the kind of language that they use, right? Mm. And that's one reason why we can't even talk to the Russians, because they're just evil. And we can't listen to anything they say, because they only lie. And they put the white hats on the Ukrainians. Everything the Ukrainians say is true. And it's just sort of, it defined for them, it's just say that this was a crusade that they signed up for, and where they, for the first time in their lives, they felt like they were doing something. They weren't just managers of this sort of, of this increasingly, very powerful and prosperous, but increasingly kind of irrelevant part of the world that, whose real glory days had passed. They weren't just managers. Now they are, they are generals in this crusade. And I think that that's really what they bought into, and it's consumed. It's what they've become, and they can't just walk away from it. And, now it's a lot worse. You just say, well, if we'd made a deal back then, none of this would happen. But now Ukraine's devastated, again, 1 million, maybe millions dead, who knows? Cities absolutely leveled. We can't just say now, oops, we made a mistake, and just, agree to the Russian terms. We can't do that, because people will immediately say, well, why didn't you agree to the Russian terms, which were a lot better just a couple of years ago? It's, back in 2022. Why didn't you do it back then? And they won't have an answer. They won't have an answer for themselves or for anyone else.
Well, if they keep going all in like they are, then it just will continually, it will destroy Europe. It is destroying Europe, right? The more
Right.
that they put in there, you're draining your resources, your economy, the sanctions are backfiring. You're isolating yourself from the rest of the world by keeping this war going. So they've just committed all their chips in here. And if they continue to just steal other people's chips and throw them in as well, then they're just
right.
going to be what will happen to Europe at the end? Will they just completely destroy Europe? Will we have like new systems of government pop up in place after this? Will this just like cause things to just completely collapse? Like this system failed because we, the people, didn't want this, but you went all in on this war. You squandered all of our money, all of our industry, our electricity, everything. It's gone. You get it's all for what? For 2 million dead Ukrainians and the loss of eastern Ukraine, which was always Russian speaking anyways. Like there was a civil war going on there since 2014 for nothing. You just lose it all. Okay. So I don't get it. What?
Right. Yeah.
So what happens to Europe?
I think one thing it clearly is having an effect on Europe and the way that Europe is governed, and it's not good. Europe is moving away from a system of laws and moving away from democracy. And we can see it in the treatment of the frozen assets. Right. Just recently, there was this move made to actually indefinitely freeze the assets, and they declared an emergency, and it was kind of absurd. There's an emergency. We're not going to, by our rules, if we have even one dissenting vote, then the freezing of the assets ends. Right. But we declared it an emergency, and therefore it has to become permanent. And it was a clear abuse of that emergency clause. There's no economic emergency. It was claimed that there was, but there wasn't. The emergency is that Ukraine might lose the war. I think that's what it is. But I remember actually it may have been all the way back in 2022. When the question of the frozen assets came up. 2022 or 2023, and Ursula von der Leyen was talking about. And she said, we, Europe, we are a community of laws. And, therefore, we have to, when speaking about these assets, we have to figure out a way to do this legally because we're a community of laws. And I remember back then thinking, that's a strange statement to make, because if you're really a community of laws, if you're a community of laws, then the thing is, you look at it, and if it's against the law, you don't do it. So essentially, we're going to figure out a way to do it. We're going to come up with some scheme and call it legal. And it just really struck me then. And that's what you see. They are actually moving away from a community, actually being a system of laws. That's what, that's why these alarm bells are ringing, again, from the central banks and these companies is saying that, this is against the law. But they've decided, to hell with the law. And in that, you can also see a move away from democracy. Again, like I've said, they're not going to their own people and saying, hey, we need to do this, because they know they can't. So they're trying to find a way, just amongst themselves to steal this money and to break the law doing it. I mean, just in this, you can see a Europe that is moving increasingly towards, a central, undemocratic authority and away from a system of laws. And maybe, the longer this war goes on, that's maybe the more we're going to see more of that. Now, that's the real danger. We can say, well, maybe there will be some of these populist parties will rise and make a real difference and maybe save Europe. I don't have a whole lot of hope in that, but maybe. There are people, I think, who are very realistic in some of these parties, and who really, if these parties already have a lot of popular support, and maybe if they do seize the reins of power, we can see a real change. That's what we can hope for, a peaceful change in direction in Europe. But then we also see this increasing authoritarianism, and that's the other thing. It's like these people are not going to let go, and this is something they'll. This war is not just destroying Ukraine, but I think in a way it's really destroying Europe too.
Yeah. I mean, Israel, the United States, the EU, we see them all acting so irrationally, and it's because they're desperate. It's because things are falling apart, and we're going to see them continue to lash out more and more, and we'll see until the whole thing collapses. And then, I think the whole thing, the funny thing is it could happen any day, because I think what we'll end this will be some type of financial collapse within the West, the system. I think that's, as long as the printing press is going and there's still the dollar's reserve currency and is able to fund all of these projects from, Israel as a project, Ukraine as a project, all these things. As long as you're able to fund it, the establishment will keep on moving. That's what it's built to do. It's built to spend that money and keep on expanding until the system implodes. And, we might be getting close to that. And I mean, this is a whole nother discussion with the economy, but I think that might be that's the way out, probably, unless there's just some massive war that does the same thing. Right? Do you think that's kind of where we're headed to? Financial collapse or hot war, kinetic war? And it's as the empire falls apart.
Or maybe both. I don't know. Maybe both. Yeah, it doesn't look good. I mean, war is on the horizon. War talk is increasingly common in Europe, at the same time, the economic outlook is bleak. And, about the war talk, it was just Mark Rutte, very recently said that Europe needs to prepare, to make the sacrifices or maybe even greater sacrifices than their grandfathers made in World War II. What is he talking about?
But this time we're fighting with the Nazis. This time it's different.
Yeah.
It's nuts. Okay. Well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Okay. All right.
Bye-bye.